Good afternoon, Mike. Welcome to this week's top most probe reports from our internet weather, ending yesterday with April 5th, 2021. Here again, we're looking at the top 10 ports. If you look at top three, there is no movement at all, like 23,445, 0 ICMP, supposed to see 0 ICMP picking up to the high. But nevertheless, at number 4 is where I want to spend a little bit more time with respect to port 3389, which is our remote desktop protocol, which jumped 6 places from last week to 4th position. And number 5 is 6379 TCP, which is associated with Redis protocol. I'm not going to talk about this 6379 because last 2 weeks, our analysts basically talked more in depth about this port, and they did an amazing job explaining what's happening with respect to Redis. At number 6 is a 22 TCP, which is a SSH port, followed up by 1433 for Microsoft SQL port, 81 and 443 there for HTTP as well as HTTPS ports. And at the top 10 is 123 UDP, which is for network time protocol. And it kind of dropped from 5 positions from last week to 10th position. And moving on, this is some data collected from our honeypots to see what's happening with this RDP Pro. As I said, it stands for Remote Desktop Protocol, but rather than that, it's more popular in recent times with Blue Keep vulnerability. And that's one of the well-known one, but there are so many vulnerabilities for 3389. What did I observe? There seems to be lots of scanning occurring from Russian Federation area, and looking at the graph here, basically pie chart, most of the activity seems to be RDP, or which is supposed to be looking with respect to 3389 TCP, right? That's good. So with that knowledge, I believe this could be just some change in activity with respect to 3389 and CBB and our common backbone. In order to confirm that, what we did is we went back 90 days in our data and tried to see what's happening on this port. As you can see on x-axis is the timeline going back to 90 days, and basically on the y-axis is what's the volume happening. By looking at I think there are regular times there's just a peak at certain times, but the volume seems to be at almost at certain levels. That's surprising to see that this port has peaked up to the top 10 when we are observing no much major deviations in the activity. So let's see how it looks from the scan sources point of view. Here, basically, again, it's the same timeline, but on the y-axis, we have a number of unique sources scanning on this specific port in any given hour. Again, I think the number of sources varied between 800 per hour to, I think, at the peak, sometimes around 1200 to 1250. But I believe if you look at closely around start of this month, I think maybe at the end of March, there's a basically drop in number of scanners. Because of that, I believe it kind of creeped into the top 10. And that seems to agree with what we are seeing with respect to honeypot results also. Bulk of the activity is as expected related to RDP. And most of them from our report seems to be aligned with the data in the sense there's a scanning happening from most often from Russian as well as from European-based IPs. Other than that, I did not see anything specific pertaining to the increase in the activity. This is basically that's a geographical map distribution of all the scanning IPs where it is concentrated heavily. But as you can see, the heavy concentration is in the Russian Federation region, followed by some parts of North and some South America, but seems to agree with what we are observing it.
Yeah, I mean, RDP is a often targeted front door for threat actors, right? I mean, they're absolutely looking to target that. if organizations have not relocated those RDP servers behind a VPN requiring two-factor authentication, they really, really should do so. That should be prioritized on their list of mitigations. Data for years has pointed to RDP being a problem. And so anytime you start to see an increase like this targeting those systems, one of the first things I kind of wonder is if somebody found a new zero-day looking for that platform, right, and are going through and looking for it. So definitely interesting. It raises some eyebrows whenever that particular port activity starts to jump up there, right?
And also, I think that in the name itself is remote, which is so alluring to anybody with malicious intent. Like you said, it would be one of the first step into the door into the corporate networks. And definitely anything related to remote access, the related ports or tools should be hardened enough and maybe followed with strict access control layers. Just moving on to the next one in the sense, these are the next set of top 20. Here, I would like to point out about the number 14.1 in the sense 389 UDP, which is typically stands for LDAP. I know in one of your stories you mentioned briefly about LDAP, which is like directory active protocol, but most often it's used for credential sharing and other stuff. And because of that, it's also enticing for the attackers to have special interest with the port in combination with 3389, I believe. Anything with credential access, remote access, obviously are from prime targets for the attackers. Okay, let's see what's happening along with here in here. Actually, if you look at it at the number 19.11.2.11 was also interesting port in the sense it's often used for memcached, but it's interesting in the sense they're most often used for the DDoS attacks. The reason they're heavily used is that they have a high amplification compared with, let's say, 53 DNS amplification or NTP reflection attacks. I think because of that, attackers have always a special interest with 11.2.11. But in that scenario, they kind of dropped it. But we would briefly see what's happening with 389 UDP. Okay, here again, I'm showing back the last 3 months of data, looking at the scan volume as well as scan sources occurring on each hour on the specific port. Though there's not much activity, but there is one interesting observation is that you see that the big three spikes compared to the rest of the volume. Those seems kind of picked up my interest. When I say on this, basically almost at the span of 30 days, roughly at the 30 days time where there was a big scanning happening. Like when they go up to about 1100 to 1200, somewhere that number, the scanners come in, they do their job, and they go dormant for another next 30 days, and again they come up, they do that. So that's what typically happening. So what I did is I tried to pick up a report from this big spike in the latest one. Like I think it occurred on March 30th. So when I picked that report and looked at it, basically, I mean, even though the bubbles are very small, but if you look at the heat map, there seems to be highly concentrated in some areas, and the sources are basically coming from these areas. So that's interesting. I mean, just the one you see in somewhere in the ocean is basically, I think, a misrepresentation of the latitude and longitude value, but I think it's somewhere near to Africa there. But other than that interesting spikes, there's not any related activity happening to point out some security related activity occurring. But nevertheless, I thought it would be interesting to see this pattern and see maybe probably I would try to do going back maybe further down like last 365 days and see whether we have this kind of phenomenon happening at the regular intervals of 30 days every month. And moving on to the next session of about the top sources in the probing. Here we are seeing how many scans the sources are happening with respect to specific port. Again, interesting is if you look at the top 7, 1 to number 7 in the rankings, there's absolutely no change from the last week. We typically see maybe the top 3 or top 4, they kind of hold their positions from week to week. But this is the first time I've seen that the top 7 did not change from last week itself. At the number 10, we have 555 TCP, which we know about. It's related to Android debug bridge, which basically using various exploits for propagation by, I think, Mirai-like variants and IoT-based botnets. But I would like to see if we have any trending here. Again, I'm going back the past 90 days, and again, you can see somewhere between mid-February, the number of sources actually increased. And with a little blip in the first week of March, again, actually picked up. That means it's constantly up high above in the scanning activity, and it seems to be continuing in the past 90 days. Anything specific? I think I forgot to mention the number of scanners here, but from here you can see around anywhere between 11,000 scanners were plotted here. And you can see they are heavily distributed in the sense across North and South Americas, Russian Federation-based countries, as well as some parts of Asia-Pacific region. I think basically looking for anything with the ADB ports open. And that's how basically Android devices try to provide the management interface to the devices. Because of that reason, they are of prime interest to the attackers to exploit them. And constantly we are seeing that activity happening day in, day out.
When you look at a map like that, to me that seems like, these are scan sources. So this to me would, suggest this is, very strongly a botnet or something along those lines. Is that an accurate way to interpret this?
That's exactly the accurate statement in the sense. I mean, like I said, Mirai is one of the known ones to first incorporate ADB, but there are various botnets like offshoot of Mirai. They specifically use 555 TCP for their propagation. Besides, this is not only the port. They use various ports. For example, another port comes to our mind is 2323 TCP, which is alternate port, but it's heavily used by these IoT botnets. So, I think if you remember, if you analyzed, if you've seen any botnets, if we talked about any botnets, there's not only one specific port. They always use list of ports, like 23, maybe 81, 23, 23, 555, and also maybe 6378. All these ports are constantly used by these botnets. And your statement is absolutely correct, and that's what we are seeing. Even with all these efforts, still we are seeing so many sources happening. That means there's still so many devices open with ADB port. And just to wrap it up, scan activity as we observed from HoneyNet, and there's most of RDP, but there's also ADB-based, which is ADB for Android debug port, but there is also remote desktop protocol activity, as well as HTTP related to some sort of NTP servers. So definitely there's a mix of activity happening with respect to this support activity. I think maybe because of that, there's some scanning happening, and they're frequently looking for blended kind of port activity, I believe. I guess that brings to the wrap up for this week's Internet Weather.